Thank you all for coming to this event, the EU 2024 What's at Stake. I'm Ellen Fantini, Managing Editor of the European Conservative, and together with my panel, we'll discuss the EU elections, which are just a few short months away. How are they unfolding? After populist victories in Ireland with the referendum and Portugal with elections, is there momentum on the right? Our panel will discuss the dynamics of the current EU Parliament, in what directions things seem to be heading, where priorities are shifting, and we'll have a look at polling data, perhaps discuss predictions, and talk about voters' priorities in this election season. We have a packed agenda, so without further ado, I'll introduce the panel in the order in which they'll speak. We have Peter Kleppe. Peter is the editor-in-chief of Brussels Report, an international research fellow at the US think tank Property Rights Alliance, a columnist and frequent commentator in European and international media. Between 2008 and 2020, he was head of the Brussels office of Open Europe, which covers EU policy and Brexit. He is listed among ZN Consulting's top 40 EU influencers on Twitter. Next to Peter, we have Doru Frantescu. He's the CEO and founder of EUmatrix.eu. He has over 15 years of experience in advising on EU policymaking, having previously founded and headed VoteWatch Europe. He has been nominated by Politico Europe among the top 40 influential personalities in EU affairs. His work has been quoted as examples of best practices by the EU and national institutions, and he's been interviewed by the media around the world. He's also co-author of How to Work with European Institutions. Next to Doru, we have James Holland. James Holland is a political consultant who has worked in the EU bubble for 15 years. During this time, he worked for Conservative MEP Daniel Hannan. He's also worked as communications director of the ECR party. James resigned from the EU Parliament after the British vote to leave the EU and has since worked as a political and communications advisor here in Brussels for a host of public and private sector clients. And next to James is Frank Ferretti. He's the executive director of MCC Brussels. He's an author and social commentator and an emeritus professor of sociology at the University of Kent, author of more than 26 books. Frank's studies have been devoted to an exploration of the cultural developments in Western societies. In recent years, he's published several studies on the impact of the culture wars on family life, socialization, education, and public life. So we have much to discuss with not a lot of time to do so. So let's dive right in. Peter, you've been in Brussels for several elections now, and you're an observer of the institutions. I'd like to ask you first, is this time different? In other words, in every election cycle, politicians make promises, they make compromises. Looking at where we are now, is this time different? Are the promises different? And how do you see things shaping up for 2024?
Well, I'm afraid not. Yesterday there was a new opinion poll out, another one, pan-European opinion poll, and every time you see the same thing, which is that the EPP is likely to be the biggest group, then the socialists. And then you have the pack of three, ECR, ID, and Renew, and then two small groups, the Greens and the far left. Already last time around, von der Leyen was dependent on votes from the Polish Euroskeptic.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you. For those of you watching at home, when you say von der Leyen, can you explain who you mean?
The current Commission President. Also known as Aunt Ursula here in Brussels. Queen Ursula. So yeah, like the big coalition, so to speak, EPP, SD, Renew, was seen as unreliable by von der Leyen already 5 years ago to be voted in. So already then she had to rely on the Polish governing party. I mean, it's a one-off vote. The question is what they got in return, not so much, I think. Again, I think we're going to see a similar horse trading exercise. So I don't think the Eurosceptic forces, to use an imperfect term, will be sufficiently strong, to stop this. I would love to, of course. I would love to see that. But looking at opinion polls, I don't think that's the case yet. That's a pity because it's strongly needed. If you look at the current European Parliament, they seem completely immune for all the protests from farmers, the protests from industry against the European green policies. They only in the last month they voted for the nature restoration law, for sharper emission targets, even for mandatory building renovation, which according to the Italian government is simply something that both governments and citizens cannot afford. And I think if you keep your pulse a little bit with society anywhere in Europe, people are complaining about higher and higher rents, higher and higher construction, building prices, even here in Brussels, which is traditionally relatively cheap for a big city. None of this seems to penetrate the bubble of the European Parliament. That's why we need some kind of an upset. But I don't think the signal will be sufficiently strong.
Well, thank you. You've already started us off on some fantastic themes. What do you think? Are the polls bearing out what Peter is predicting? Polls have, of course, gotten famously populist movements wrong. I'm thinking of, for example, Brexit or the election of Donald Trump. So polls often don't read well populist sentiments. So I'd love to have your thoughts about where we're headed, what the polls are saying, and whether you think we can trust them.
Yeah, polls cannot capture everything, all of the details, and they can get it wrong when the difference is very small, like it was in the case of Brexit, like it was in the case of Trump, also because there you had a binary choice, it's either or. However, in the European election, it's something different because the electoral systems are proportional. So even if you get it wrong 3%, it still doesn't make a big difference in the overall outcome of the European Parliament. So what we're seeing now, unless we have big shocks between now and the elections, this is what we can expect, what Peter has just said. Big shocks like what? Big shocks like another COVID or another war, which can shift this around substantially. But otherwise, what do the polls show? They show indeed that, as Peter said, the EPP is going to stay the biggest political family in the House, having pretty much the same numbers as now. If they manage to recruit some new parties from across the continent, they may even increase a little bit their number of seats. And then what? How about the rest? Yeah? And then how about the rest? In a few words, everything that's to the left of EPP loses seats. Everything that's to the right of EPP gains seats, which will tell you where the system is going. All of this makes the EPP likely the pivotal force in the next European Parliament, which is very different from what we're seeing now. In this Parliament, the Socialists have won more votes than the EPP, even though the Socialists are smaller. Why? Because they had a bigger coalition potential with Renew, with the Greens, and in many cases they won more votes. On matters like nature restoration, like Green Deal in general, even the Greens have won more votes than the EPP. Yeah, so that will tell you where things, how strong the center-left majority was on some topics. That's another topics like defense, the budget, the EPP has done better. But indeed, the system moves more to the right. And why is that? It's not necessarily due to an increase. If you look at the numbers, it's not necessarily due to an increase of the anti-European or Eurosceptic sentiment across the EU, because at least according to the data that we're having from the Eurobarometer, the trust in the EU has been stable over the past 10 years, in some countries even going up, even in countries like Poland and Hungary. what happens is that the trust in the political leaders in these countries has gone down substantially. It is much harder now to govern national countries in Europe than it was before. If you are a political leader, prime minister or president, you are becoming unpopular much faster than before. And the governments are weaker. They are less stable. They change much faster than before. This is what happened over the past decade for a number of reasons, including a certain level of frustration or cumulative frustration over a very long period of time since the beginning of the financial crisis in 2008. If you look at the data, the economic optimism index, it has almost continuously been on the negative, people being pessimistic about where the economy and the society is going. If you look at how the citizens are answering to the question whether they think that children today are going to have a better life than the current generation, Europe is the only region in the world where they say, no, we don't think so. We're at -4. In some countries like Italy, we're at -31, which means people don't really like the direction in which their country is going. And if you don't like it, what are you going to do? You're not going to vote for the same ones, same politicians that you have seen around for years. You're going to try something new. Whether that works or not, that's a different discussion. But this is the perception of the citizens, and that explains the behavior that we're seeing now. What implications will that have in these new arithmetics of the parliament? As Peter has said, Queen Ursula will still have a hard time being pushed through both the parliament and the council, because the EPP will likely be the biggest political force in the parliament. However, in the council, situation is quite complicated. EPP is not in control of any of the big four governments, Germany, France, Italy, and Spain, which means negotiations will take a long time, which is probably also the reason for which we're not going to see the vote on the president of the commission in July, as we used to in previous cycles, and this has been delayed to September to leave enough room for negotiation over the summer. So, indeed, votes will have to be taken also from elsewhere outside of the EPP Socialist Renew centrist coalition in order to push the president and the college through the institutions. Where elsewhere? No longer the Polish Law and Justice, probably there is no reason for them to support anymore. There are only two other options. Either to the left to the Greens, which is unlikely, or some parts of the ECR, which is, I would guess, much more likely, and if it is my guess, and my colleagues have known better the ECR family, but my guess, and you confirm it or not, is that the votes of the Italian ECR are going to be crucial. Why? Because they will have a very big delegation, maybe even 27 MEPs according to the current polls. There will be changes on some of the policies. Our simulations show that policies like the Green Deal will suffer. We're not seeing a new turn there. The shift is not as big as to completely generate a new turn. But a slowdown of that agenda, it's very, very likely. And then we can discuss other policies as well. Thank you.
So, James, you've participated as a political insider in some of these elections in the past, and now you're sitting here as a consultant. I'd love to have your take on, first of all, this Euroskepticism and how it's perhaps changed or morphed into something else, and then perhaps a few words on the business sector's points of view on the upcoming elections. I think Doru has very well explained some of the individual citizens' concerns, particularly relating to the cost of living. It would be interesting to have also the business perspective.
Sure, thank you very much. I think I share Peter's assessment that we do see this kind of grand coalition of Renew, the Socialists, and EPP taking shape again. I'm a bit more optimistic, though, because I think my first election was 2004. This will be my fifth. And what I've seen over those years, while the change has been gradual, we have seen this concentration of Euroscepticism into something concrete. Now, it is still very messy. I think the ECR is also a marriage of convenience. ID is a marriage of convenience. We've also got a lot of non-inscrits, the independent MEPs, who are sitting there a little bit unsure of where to join. Often countries have 6 or 7 political parties that are already sitting in groups. So when a new party surges to 20%, they don't have anywhere to sit because they've got a political enemy already established in one of the groups. They kind of feel lost. So we've had this rising skepticism towards the ever greater union. We saw that already with the referendums in 2005. We've seen that with Brexit. We've seen how now the EU doesn't present big treaty reforms. What it does is it rides off crises
as a way to expand its power into healthcare, as we saw with COVID, with migration, we've seen also powers taken there. So what we see is this growing skepticism, which is struggling to take shape. That's also because if you are, let's say, skeptical of the direction the European Union is taking, you may then not agree on family, the importance of the family, or on migration, or on economic policy, or on the EU budget. At that point, you do start to see the divisions. But again, European political groups, I think, are formed out of convenience. So I think after these elections, we will see the chance. There's even some new parties, and I even will throw the idea out to the room for the discussion after, of a new political group, because I see a number of Eurosceptic, but soft Eurosceptics in Denmark, in the Netherlands, the new social contract. These are soft Eurosceptic parties. I don't think they would ever sit with ID. They may be tempted to sit with ECR. I think the established groups like Renew and EPP might be tempted to drag them in. But again, you have already political conflicts there, national political conflicts, which will make that difficult. So, and you need 25 MEPs from 7 countries. That's not such a difficult threshold to reach. So we have Five Star that has sat in limbo for all these years, unable to influence despite its sizable share of the vote. So just to put that out there, I am optimistic that I think we are seeing this take shape. It's just very difficult in all the wranglings and the back corridor deals that are made after European election to get something concrete. In terms of business, I think that we've seen the resistance from farmers, from industry, to exactly what Dore is saying in his great EU matrix research on how the EPP lost so many votes, despite being the biggest in the Council, biggest in the Commission, biggest in the Parliament. And that's a wake-up call for them, I think, to see that data right in front of them, to say, we're doing something wrong here. How can we be the leading actor in all those institutions, and yet we are failing to get our policies through? So there's definitely the shift to the right. There's the reliance on, I think, Meloni's party. That's a very good point. But I think that because we get to this point where there is enough Eurosceptic parties in the non-ASCII, in ID, in ECR, also in the far left, you get to a point where if you can hit about 180, 190 MEPs, you can start to call for committees of inquiry, for example. That's something that's been generally used in the European Parliament as something to follow crises, LuxLeaks, Panama Papers, things like this. But we get to the point now where you'll have enough MEPs, and you need 3 political groups and about 180 MEPs, to ask the Conference of Presidents in the European Parliament to inquire on a specific policy aspect. But here you could start to bring into question the common agricultural policy. You could start talking about specific policy and say, we've mismanaged this, there's crises, there's inflation in prices, there's uncertainty for industry, and to actually grill specific commissioners in the Parliament, highly mediatized event, where you can grill them more than you would normally be able to. Now, the reason why this hasn't worked in the past, just to finish, is that generally we have this grand coalition that dominates the 3 institutions. The 3 big groups dominate all 3 institutions. The way you can get out of that is by having that share of the vote drop to a certain point where all the opposition groups can get together and force the Renew Energy Commissioner, the Socialist Labour Commissioner, the EPP Energy Commissioner, to all sit down and answer questions about how this policy wasn't done well, and how are you going to improve your performance in the next 5 years? And I think that that's, we're getting to the point where those numbers are there now. Of course, the Conference of Presidents can always just exclude this call for an inquiry, but if there's enough media buzz around it, they'll be obliged to at least address it, answer, and explain their reasons for rejecting this inquiry.
Frank Ferretti, MCC Brussels is hosting an event tomorrow. The populist moment has arrived. So I'd like to ask you, is populism a dirty word? And, or does it reflect the real sentiments of ordinary people who see the Brussels bubble as either deaf or insensitive to their concerns?
Well, populism is a dirty word in Brussels. But my objective and the MCC Brussels objective is to embrace populism and to demonstrate its positive dimension, because populism is a force that gives voice to the people and allows people's concern to gain definition in a way that is almost the very opposite to what's happening here. Now, most of the speakers I agree with up to a point. But the thing is that what happens in Brussels is a reality that's founded upon its capacity to insulate itself from the pressures of everyday life. So you have an insulated institution that desperately tries to ensure that it is not really subject to the pressures and the passions of normal human beings. I think the recent developments with the farmers' protest shows you the double reality, the reality of normal everyday life and the way things pan out within the institutions. Now, two things are happening that are quite important. One is that none of the big governments, Germany, Italy, Holland, France, have succeeded in gaining any durable legitimacy. They're all fragile in their own kinds of ways. What's happening in Europe, and this is something that I really am very pleased about, probably the best thing that's happening in Europe, is that the traditional post-war mainstream parties, or left and right as it happens, are all unraveling. I mean, Italy is an extreme case, but you look at, for example, France, where Macron is playing catch-up game with the Ralliement National, and where someone like Jordan Bardella is able to almost, in a sense, define what the important political issues are, a real turnaround that happened. Look at Holland, where these old-time EU-file politicians have really been exposed as somehow being irrelevant to the life of people in Holland. So we have an interesting unraveling process that's been going on for some time. But this is the year when things have really kind of kicked in. Now, populism is to some extent the beneficiary of this. It's not all about its internal dynamic, its internal stream. It's benefited from the fact that the Eurocrats, both nationally and within Brussels, have lost a lot of ground, at least in terms of authority and legitimacy. And therefore, I think we need to understand that whatever happens with the EPP is, to some extent, no longer as important as it used to be. I mean, Ursula might be the princess of Europe, but in the real world, Ursula would never get elected to anything other than a parish councillor, you know, sort of in Bavaria, right? So it's quite important to realize what's really happening here. And as a result of that, I am very optimistic, because I think that what's really happening now is that people are waking up. It doesn't necessarily simply take a Euroskeptic form, because a lot of people hope that Europe is better than the national government. It's a contradictory kind of process. But nevertheless, what you have is an intensification of the suspicion and the alienation, estrangement from the mainstream. So that's a very important process. Can I just say one other thing? Because I don't know as much about Brussels as you guys do, because I've just arrived very recently. But when I talk to MEPs, you know, it's very clear to me that the groups are not going to stay the way they are at the moment. Everybody I talk to tells me that even within the ID, there's a lot of talk about some of the parties moving towards the ECR. There's a lot of talk within the ECR that maybe we should be hanging out with some of the EPP person, maybe getting the more right-wing EPP people on our side. So there's a lot of fluidity going on at the moment, which means that the shape, the balance between the different groups is going to shift. And one reason why that's happening is partially because some of the parties are realizing that they cannot simply live in their own kind of castle in the air. There's got to be some connection with what's happening on the ground. And that, to me, is a really kind of a very important, very significant process. And you know, the EPP in particular, which has been trading on its, you know, on the routine of doing what's been doing all the time, is really running out of time. I mean, there's only so far that people will tolerate this really boring, bureaucratically inclined EPP that actually has done nothing. And it's called right-wing. But if EPP is right-wing, then I lose an ability to understand what's the difference between the center and the right and the left, because the EPP has changed quite fundamentally. When you talk to them one-to-one, you know, there isn't all that much difference between them and Renew. You know, I mean, it's almost as if they're talking from the same cultural script. So these are very exciting times. And I think that what we got to do is basically, like the little boy said, the emperor's got no clothes.
I wonder if any of you think that this very clear, let's say, disaffection or this dissatisfaction with the establishment, with the Eurocrats, whether that will lead to indifference or people not voting. In other words, we see the surges of populist sentiments, but is that coupled with perhaps not even being inclined to vote at all? Dora, what do you think?
The only data that we have about the turnout comes from the European Parliament itself, so it has to be seen with a grain of salt. The Parliament, however, is optimistic about the, about the turnout, that there will be more people coming to vote than even in 2019. So we'll have to see if their data is correct or not. But I think you mentioned why would people come to vote. They come to vote indeed mainly as a result of, or why they vote to the right of EPP, let's say, for dissatisfaction with their leaders and with the way countries have been governed, with the socioeconomic situation, which hasn't been the greatest, for the past decade. Whether they vote against the Brussels bureaucracy, I don't know, because they don't know much about it. We know much about the Brussels bureaucracy here in Brussels. Outside of Brussels, realistically, in the member states, they don't know much about it. They will maybe know a lot about it now during the electoral campaign, because I'm sure some of the leaders, the populist leaders, will mention this, will try to bring this into the campaign, will try to make it a political issue and try to capitalize on it. How much they will succeed, we'll have to see, and we'll have to look at the data. So I think the results that we're going to see is still the outcome of the national political and economic situation, rather than what's going on within the Brussels bureaucracy. But that, we'll see in the future. This is a trend. Now people are knowing more and more about what's going on in Brussels, that's for sure. The information now penetrates more the national political arena than before, as a result of the political campaigning and campaigning from other groups. It's a long-term process.
There's one thing we haven't discussed at all, which is in the real world, the issues confronting Parliament and the EU have changed. So if I was sitting here 4 years ago or 8 years ago, I'd be talking about very different issues than that. So for example, how long can the EU and Parliament and the Commission avoid confronting economic reality? That Europe is becoming less and less competitive. That all its talk about the green and the digital transition, it's not going to be realized if you're not investing in technology. We have such low rates of productivity that in the global scheme of things, Europe is really messed up unless that issue is confronted. The second big issue that isn't being discussed and the EU is avoiding seriously dealing with this is defense. We're now living in a world where wars are no longer an abstract kind of concept. The EU was set up and it claimed that its legitimacy is based on the fact that there is peace in Europe. It's always argued that peace in Europe, that's who we are. Well, there's a war going on in Ukraine and between Russia and the Ukrainians, but the likelihood of other wars breaking out, there's already the big war in the Middle East, which has a blowback effect over here, is really, really important. And thirdly, the third big issue, these are all connected in many, many ways, is migration. Because migration is very much linked to the economic recovery. I mean, the way that Germans argue that the way we avoid investing in industry in Germany is getting 1 million more migrants. In Italy argues something similar there as well. If that's going to happen, then not only are we going to create a greater migration crisis than at present, but our economy on a European level will remain fairly static in the way that it is now. What I'm really trying to say is that at some point the EU can no longer avoid just dealing with little things like, mainstreaming gender politics. They're going to have to deal with the real world, and the real world has shifted quite dramatically in the recent years. So I think that's something that we need to take on board.
Well, it seems to me that there's been a fair amount of what Frank has said. Let's call it moving chairs around the Titanic. So avoiding the difficult topics. And then what I think we've also seen is, I'll call it pseudo-populist virtue signaling. So in other words, many of the parties are sort of feeling which way the wind is blowing, and so their rhetoric, or even some of their, let's say, small decision-making is trying to reflect that, but just on a surface level. I mean, we've seen, especially with agricultural policy, let's say decisions that are referred to in other media as concessions to the farmers or giving into the farmers. But from where I'm sitting, it looks like this kind of pseudo-populist virtue signaling. So in other words, tossing crumbs to the little people or to the noisy farmers so that they'll be quiet until after June. So I'm wondering if that's something that the panel's been seeing, these sort of like dropping crumbs to quiet people down rather than anything substantial that really addresses what are very serious concerns, as Frank laid out. Peter.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what we see in the EU response to the farmer protesters. So, for example, the pesticides, the restriction in the pesticides regime that von der Leyen was pushing. She actually did not, abandon this idea. She said, "Oh, let's postpone it for 1 year and then see." Also, I think it's quite telling that Ms. Hayé, the leader of Renew, right? Which is the most prominent representative of the party of Macron in the European Parliament. She still, until this day, refuses to say that the European Green Deal files have to be reviewed. So I think the debate is not about shall we slow down the European Green Deal. It has already been slowed down, thankfully. I mean, it was so extreme, if you look at it, that it was hard not to slow down. I think the real debate is, shall we look at it again and abolish a number of these very problematic regulations? But even when you're talking about the ban on the combustion engine, I mean, it's just hard to believe that the CDU, the party of von der Leyen, endorsed her for a second term, while they could not even get the EPP to commit to scrapping the ban on the combustion engine, which has been invented in Germany, right? So of course, electric vehicles are fine if people want them, but I think it's crazy to to impose certain technology, certainly when you're disadvantaging your own companies. European companies are strong when it comes to the combustion engine. Chinese companies are strong when it comes to EVs because they have this integrated supply chain with batteries and everything. And I'm fine with letting Chinese companies, offer their cars to Europeans. I think that's fine, but obviously they should not be subsidized effectively under the label of climate, or in a very dodgy reasoning. So just to say, if even the EPP cannot, go that far to, simply scrap the ban on the combustion engine, I think we have indeed a very long way to go still.
I was working for part of the automobile sector, and I was surprised to see that some of the largest car manufacturers in Europe were all for the banning of the combustion. When I discovered that, I was like, what the hell is going on? And they had adopted this long-term vision that it was time to adapt the factories and to find the new technology that then Europe could specialize in and potentially then export again, rather than us all buying Chinese cars or cars from other countries. But what was clear there was that I think that this is the power of Brussels to have a ideological view on some of these things. And it can build such an impression of consensus in this city that it's very hard for people to have the courage to stand up to it. And having worked for a lot of companies who have reacted too late to these policies being formed, developed in the working groups, in the council and in the commission, it's very important for you to have already started to engage with the next commission. Already now, the different political groups are sitting in meetings now determining what will be on their negotiation card when they go and sit opposite the new political groups with their new size of groups. And it is very important for companies, for sectors, for associations to already be engaged. I know many are. But I was very surprised to see how late some of these woke up to what a commission can pass during a 5-year term and what it can do to your sector.
Well, yeah, I totally agree with that. The first time I came to Brussels was 5-6 years ago in my capacity as an academic, and I was asked by some of the people involved in the chemical engineering to talk about regulation and risk. And I became very interested in this because I realized through my studies that one of probably the only thing that the European Union is really good at is regulating things. Sort of if it moves, you regulate it. That seems to be the main impulse kind of behind it. But the thing that's very interesting is that at a certain point, the regulatory mechanism, which was always in a sense, a problem in terms of limiting innovation. I mean, innovation in the EU has really slowed down for a number of reasons because of the precautionary principle and various other regulatory mechanisms. That has in the last 5 years acquired, as you're saying, James, this ideological character where where you lose sight of the fact that there's an economic reality. And when you think about what's happening in Germany, which was meant to be the powerhouse, the economic powerhouse of Europe, and the way they've almost committed suicide by first getting rid of nuclear energy, then going on almost systematically asking the question, how can we screw our economy up? I mean, it's almost as if that was the impulse behind it. You then realize that the economic problems that we have in Europe are, to some extent, of our own making, because we're almost saying, well, let's tie our hand behind our back and compete with the Chinese and the Americans, not with two arms, but with one. And I think that's something that people are really scared to take up, because you're right, people are scared to say that this whole Green Deal is a pile of horse manure. I mean, which is what it is. It's got no real virtue inherently, but people are really scared to come out, because then they'll be denounced as you hate the environment, you hate nature, and all the rest of that. Whereas actually, that's got nothing to do with it. And it seems to me that our job here in Brussels is to expose the ideological dimensions of so much of the policy making, which they present. It masquerades as neutral and technical, whereas in fact, underneath it all, it's entirely ideologically driven.
If I could just come back as well, just to the question you posed to Peter, which is the fact that parties suddenly give out these little, populist biscuits around elections. I mean, that always happens. MEPs are elected, they know they have 5 years, they sit very comfortably, and as it gets towards the end of their term, they start to check the polls, they start to see where am I potentially going to end up on the list, and then they start to worry, and then they start listening to people, and they start saying the things that voters are saying in their constituency. So that's always going to happen. You should almost have elections more often to keep those MEPs more plugged in to what people are demanding, but that would grind the bureaucracy here to a total halt, and I don't think we'd ever go anywhere, which also may not be a bad thing. But so no, I just wanted to say that point there, that's inevitable in the process, the system we go, and it's very valuable to have that moment when the Commission has to at least adopt some of those key citizen positions.
Thank you. We have quite a large audience here, and I'm sure that members of the audience might have either questions or remarks of their own. So before I ask any other questions, do we have questions from the audience, remarks from the audience? And you'll just have to wait for the microphone to be passed carefully over that way.
Thank you very much. I'm Herman Terj, I'm from Vox, from the ECR. I want to say, I want to insist we have an historical occasion now. It's an opportunity to break up this majority that we have been suffering for all the existence of the history of this parliament, and to break it up and to bring the EPP to the dilemma, I think, to the historical dilemma, where are they going to be? And for that we need solid groups on the conservative side. I agree very much with you that thing is very liquid, and now we will see how it ends. Let's say in the beginning of the next legislature. But the occasion is there, and I think we should all be very, very, let's say, lucid and almost disciplined not to spoil the possibility, this enormous possibility that we have, really to go into 5 years term where we could start not only to moderate, really directly to abolish some of the worst things that are happening here in this parliament, and to have the strength enough to block very dangerous developments and to amend many others. So that's why I would ask everybody to be very aware of that, and of not falling into the temptation of going the soft way of the EPP, which would bring us again to a mainstream where nothing ends. We have to break with this parliament and to break up this parliament.
Yeah, thank you. Norman Lewis from MCC Brussels. I just want to ask Frank just to pursue this point a bit further about this gap between reality and the insulation of pressure, because there's a very famous saying in Brussels, which is that whoever you vote for, the Commission's going to get into power. And my question is, okay, so maybe there will be some reflection in this next election on this kind of pressure from below, where the reality is kind of seeping into Brussels politics. But will that make any difference to the Commission? Because at the end of the day, surely it's about the Commission and whether it feels any pressure. And it seems to me to be the kind of institution that is totally isolated from any popular purpose. So how does that work out? How do you see that evolving through this process, which I think is going to expose this gap between reality and the bubble?
So Frank, maybe you could start, but I think the rest of the panel could probably also pick that question apart a bit.
Well, I think a lot depends on what happens within the nation states, and if you look at the electoral dynamics within France, Germany, Italy, all these countries, they're quite significant. At the moment, from my perspective, the most important country in terms of possible change is France. Because if the Ralliement National continues on its present trajectory and succeeds in getting the kind of votes that the polls demonstrate, then what you have is a possibility of displacing gradually Macron, which is very important because France and Germany are like the two most important EU kind of related states. And I think that if France is shaken up, it will be of far greater significance than Italy, even though, sort of under Meloni, the change was quite considerable, which can then begin to create a situation where a very unresponsive institution will have to begin to respond a little bit. I think you're right, the Commission is not going to change, and whatever happens on the ground, the EU kind of complex is going to stay the way it is for some time to come, because even if you had a majority ECR or majority ID in Parliament, the people that work in the Commission are not going to retire and go to southern France for a holiday. They're going to be there for a very long time to come. And I think that they have a commitment to a particular institutional and political outlook. So change is going to be very, very slow there. But on the margins, gradually, I think these elections on a national level are going to become quite significant. And that's what I'm really investing my hope in, that if that happens, then you do shake things up a little bit. And at the very least, it will mean that the really crazy policies that have been so routinely passed in a number of areas, that will slow down quite considerably. And perhaps, I think what Herman said earlier on is really quite important. I get really angry when I see in France, a division between Ralliement National and Renew, when you have in Spain very big divisions between Vox and the Conservative Party. It's a real tragedy that the right has adopted the old left's sectarian habits of undermining its own potential influence by spending a lot of time fighting each other, and that will have to somehow get sorted.
The only thing I would add is that I think Brussels is perceived as everything that comes out of here is agreed as a grand coalition, a bit like a Danish or Swedish coalition government. Everyone's kind of a bit involved, therefore we've all agreed to it. And it's this inability for us to be able to pin policies and specific legislation that comes out of the institution on parties that is quite difficult. We can agree that the Green Deal basically was a Renew, Socialist and EPP policy. And they are never confronted as that as a grouping. They're able to divide and conquer, if you like. So we don't really know who to blame. And I think it's important. The Commission is open to influence. It's open to influence usually by these three large groups that dominate all the institutions. But there is a path here to increase that scrutiny. And that's why I brought up this idea of special inquiry committees, getting the ombudsman to look at the work of the Commission. Because when you criticize the work of the Commission, you are in fact criticizing that three-party coalition. They dominate the College of Commissioners, they dominate the Council, and then they dominate the political groupings and the committees. So by putting those parties in the hot seat and grilling them on specific policies, you are starting to awaken in European citizens' eyes the fact that, there is actually specifically a coalition of parties here who are making all the decisions. At the moment, I don't think that's understood by any European citizen really concretely.
Yeah, I'd like to start by mentioning the reaction that I'm getting from some of the public affairs professionals in the industry associations and the companies where I'm doing the presentation about the outcome of the elections, and also what we're seeing in the manifesto of the political parties and their narrative. And they say, yeah, we're seeing this narrative that now the focus should move from regulation to implementation because there has been enough regulation already in this parliament. And then they say, yeah, but we've been hearing this music every time. Every 5 years during the electoral campaign, we've been hearing this music from the politicians. Can we trust it this time? And obviously, they don't trust it because probably that's not how it's going to go. As you said, the commission is going to be there. The commission is formed by civil servants. Civil servants need to justify their role, but also they have a reflex of regulation because they think they know better what's good for the society. And as technocrats, they have to do something about it. They feel obliged. Then it is up to the parliament and to the council, of course, to push back if they think that is the case. And I think that it's very good that there's a plurality in the parliament, that there are forces which are not represented in the commission, so that they feel also obliged to act as an opposition force and to scrutinize and hold accountable the commission and try to push back and build majorities that would push back. There are instruments there. No, there are, as you said, the committees of inquiry. Then there are, of course, the parliamentary questions. You can vote resolutions that would sensibilize the commission. And from what I noticed, the commission is sensitive to what comes from the parliament. They're pretty sensitive to that because then you have the commissioners, which are also politicians, and they want to follow their political careers even further after being commissioners. Life doesn't end there. You want to be popular among your political parties, and there are opportunities. Let's say for the parliament has increased powers. We know this all over the past decades and has the possibility to flex its muscle on the commission, and I expect this to be more the case in the next term.
Yeah, I want to comment the situation in France. So you see some kind of a normalization of the RN, of Team Le Pen, with Jordan Bardella, and he becoming quite popular. So indeed, perhaps she will win the next presidential election in France. But there was an interesting article in Politico this week about 2026 as a cliff edge year for finances, particularly in France and Italy. Why? Because these countries have received quite a lot of cash from the Pandemic Recovery Fund, the NGEU, the Next Generation EU scheme. So I could see a context where you have moderately Eurosceptic populist governments ultimately playing along the EU game because because of the sheer need for money. And as I mentioned before, the big difference between this EU recovery fund and regular EU spending is that regular EU spending is financed by governments basically making a donation to Brussels, whereas this recovery fund is financed by the European Commission going on the markets, issuing debt on the back of Europeans, on the back of our children and grandchildren. And I don't think it's very likely that this will be financed by member states then basically giving the cash to the Commission to pay back the debt. They will likely take out a new loan to pay back the old loan. So I think this will be the context if the RN comes to power, where they will be faced with a lot of debt, a big budget deficit, and the opportunity to get more free money on the back of the grandchildren from the EU level, where they will be very dependent on neighboring countries to which they have been financially committed, which will then again, lead to discouragement, of course, of another populist party not, delivering what it has promised. So I think that's really an important factor to keep in mind.
I think Peter is almost completely right on this because Italy and France have a high level of debt. I mean, an incredible level of debt. And therefore, they're easily placed under pressure by banks and financial institutions. So there's no doubt about it that the euro is the most important mechanism that the EU leadership has for controlling governments, and that's any government. And until now, almost every government that I know of has basically rolled over and allowed the finance markets and banks to have the last say. However, even if that happens, having a Rally Nacional government or a Meloni government in Italy is not the same as having, sort of Macron in power in France, or having, sort of even Berlusconi in power in Italy, because they are much more. I mean, if you see what happened to Meloni just this week, a couple of weeks ago, when she lost the election in Sardinia, she immediately went to Abruzzi for the next regional election, and she had to all of a sudden sound like her old populist self, just because the pressure is there. So, I think you're right, and this is what I hope you're not right, but maybe Le Pen will not go along with it in the same kind of way, despite the pressure. But nevertheless, the very fact that this is happening unleashes a dynamic, which I think is a positive dynamic, and allows movements who are really on our side to gain a degree of ascendancy. At the very least, the old order will be discredited much more and much more defensive. And I think the more defensive some of these people become, the more potential there is for genuine populist forces to gain a degree of ideological, intellectual, cultural hegemony. Because I think ultimately that's what's really important. If you can somehow, at the moment, when they mention the word populist, everybody I'm not a populist. And when they mention the word you're far right, everybody, sort of instead of throwing it back at them, that what you're doing is you're calling us these names in order to quarantine us. Well, we have to somehow change that altogether and embrace these labels and basically go on the offensive. At the moment, we're not doing that, and I think that now there's a scope for reversing this cultural dynamic a little bit and ensuring that the people's voice has got much more clarity in public life within Europe than is the case at the moment.
I think that's an excellent point, Frank. I think pushing back on, let's say, the Brussels equivalent or political equivalent of sort of just juvenile name calling really is important. I mean, it may not seem like it's so important, but in fact, I think the establishment really counts on people not wanting to be labeled with these scary names. So, for example, I read an interview recently with a German politician who said, my party is called far right or worse, but if you look at mainstream policies and positions that normal German people have held for forever, up until 5 minutes ago, that was not even conservative. It was just mainstream beliefs on everything from the culture war questions to economic questions to defense questions. And the point is pushing back and say, you can call us far right, but our positions haven't changed. Everything else has changed around us. Because I think that's very much what ordinary people feel. I think ordinary people feel like they have been sitting still and the world has just started spinning around them so quickly that it's unrecognizable. And sometimes it is unrecognizable when they look around their towns and their villages and don't see what's been there for 500 years. So I think this idea of pushing back on definitions and either embracing them or pointing out that they're simply absurd. We have time for perhaps one or two other questions or remarks from the audience. Okay.
I hear a lot about reversing policies and doing it differently.
Sorry, could you say your name?
I'm sorry, I'm Xavier Evraat. I work for Gunnar Beck, Vice President of the ID Group. When we talk about Euroskeptics and Euroscepticism and conservatives, I know what you mean. These people will obviously gain the elections, but how Eurosceptic are they really when you look at their voting behavior? For instance, when we look at the Hungarian government's priorities for their council presidency, top priority is Western Balkans enlargement. That doesn't sound to be very Eurosceptic to me. We see the biggest conservative so-called Eurosceptic players in France and Italy voting in favor of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. We see them supporting further fiscal harmonization, both in corporate taxation and in VAT. So that doesn't all sound very conservative or Eurosceptic to me. How should we interpret them if we look at their voting behavior? Or do we have the risk of having the rise of Eurosceptics in name only and not real Eurosceptics? Or am I being too skeptical about the skeptics?
All right, panel, what do we think of this? Do we have a new acronym? Asinos, this is Eurosceptic in name only. Asinos, do we see the ascent of Asinos? Or is Euroscepticism really not the right term to be using when we're talking about the range of national policies from sovereign nations deciding what's best for them and what's in their own interest, even if it ends up being let's say, buying into a bureaucratic scheme. So panel, what do you think?
Well, I do think we have Eurosceptics in name only, like we have liberals in name only, the whole Renew group. I mean, and there's been a long tradition in the British Conservative Party of being Eurosceptic in name only. I think James can testify about that. I guess it's the way politics work, but it is important to make the point, especially when it comes to the government of Ms. Meloni, to hold her to account to what she has been promising to her voters, and time and again you see how power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So.
Yeah, well, I think it's a circumstantial Euroscepticism. That is, people are voting against the policies of the EU if they don't like that particular policy, or they support it if they like that particular policy. As you said, when it comes about the enlargement, that, you have an interest in enlargement. You're neighboring the enlargement countries, you vote for it. Then you have the Greens, take the Greens for example, it's also on the other side of the spectrum. The Greens are voting against some of the EU's policies, like they're very against defense policy. Does that make them Eurosceptics? I don't know. So I think the term has become a bit obsolete, and you have to take policy by policy. The more the EU has gained powers, the more this system has become more fluid. It's more about how we organize Europe, not so much about the strength of the institutions. And then think about the United States. If someone is disagreeing with the policies in Washington, do they call them anti-American or Americano skeptics?
Yeah, I think when I first arrived in Brussels, I remember saying to people that I was Eurosceptic in the kind of sense of the word, which is that I'm skeptical of power and I'm skeptical of people taking decisions, and I always wanted that scrutinized. But I understood very quickly the Eurosceptic was an insult in this city. And to assume that position here was frowned upon by certain political groups. When I met the people from the EPP or from the old ALDE groups, they would throw it out as an insult. I think ultimately you just have to be confident. I mean, I think Meloni is the example where before she was elected, she was identified as fascist, as far right. Ultimately, you have to just power through that and propose policies that are being deemed popular by the people. And at that point, those labels can be flung away and ignored because you are at 41% approval rating. So I think that we shouldn't be too obsessed with the names that people call us. It is just to keep listening to people and to keep proposing policies that they like. I think it's a distraction sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I have to acknowledge, I was in a different life, very active in the Brexit movement. And that's about as Eurosceptical as you can get, which I think was really good for Britain. But I wouldn't advocate that for other countries. And the way that I look at it, the issue is not being Eurosceptic or not. It's where you stand on the slogan of more Europe and where you stand on the impulse towards federalism. So I think it's a much better language to use, the language of being anti-federalist, and recognize that what we like is a Europe of nations, rather than a federal Europe. I think that's the dividing line that I would suggest. And I think that that alone is difficult to uphold. But it seems to me that you can you can believe in a Europe of nations, like Hungarians do, and believe in enlargement, if for no other reasons, because you know that those countries that might come in will be on the right side of history, as opposed to Sweden or whatever. They want to sort of insult any particular national culture. In the end, the really important issue that we're all confronted with: do we want more federalism or do we want less federalism? And do we want more national sovereignty or less national sovereignty? And I think that's the dividing line that, to me, is really quite important.
I think those are perfect concluding remarks. That voters are faced with the question: how do you feel about an ever greater union? Should they bring more Europe? Is more Europe the answer, or is Europe a Europe of nations, sovereign nations who can make decisions based on their own interests? It's going to be an exciting couple of months. We hear that, in fact, something big could happen that might change everything. Let's hope it doesn't. And join us for our next panel, when we probably will be discussing what's happened. Thank you all for coming. We do have lunch for those of you who are in the room, and yes, let's watch this together unfold.